Rebecca Roiphe is a former assistant district attorney in Manhattan. That's the office that's now run by Cy Vance. She's now a law professor at New York Law School. And Chuck Rosenberg is a former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official, and they both join me now. Rebecca, let me start with you as someone that worked in this office. Your reaction to the news, the significance of it, what it means.
Right. So first of all, it's important to emphasize that there probably was a grand jury already. In order to issue any subpoena, the prosecutor needs to have a grand jury. So what this reporting signifies, at least insofar as I understand it, is that they've moved beyond the phase of gathering information under the rubric of the grand jury to actually presenting evidence to the grand jury. And those are two different phases, and that's important because you have grand juries to investigate tons of things, and many of those end in nothing. But once you go to the phase where you're actually presenting evidence before the grand jury, then prosecutors have an obligation. And the ethical obligation is to have at least probable cause that a crime has been committed. But Cy Vance's office has actually put itself forward as an office that believes that prosecutors should not even enter the grand jury unless they're convinced that they have evidence sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or something committed a crime. So my understanding of the reporting, at least the way it was explained to me, is that they've moved on to this evidence presenting phase, which itself suggests that the prosecutors themselves are convinced by the evidence that they have seen and are ready to present it to a grand jury and see if the grand jury, too, shares that conclusion.
Chuck, what's your reaction, and how does that jive with how you're thinking about this?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad Rebecca's here because practice in state grand juries is slightly different than practice in federal grand juries. But I think she's exactly right. Of course, there was a grand jury because you issue subpoenas to third parties like banks to get records. That's part of your investigation. At this phase, a latter phase, you can begin to put witnesses before the grand jury. Why would you do that? Well, for one, it informs the grand jury about the matter that's under investigation. But second, and very important, it locks witnesses into a version of events. So if you put Rebecca in the grand jury and you ask her what color was the light when she saw the accident and she says green, and later at trial she forgets or lies and says it was red, you have the transcript from her grand jury testimony, the substantive proof of what color the light was when she saw the accident. And so really important to start locking in witnesses. And can I just, one other point, Chris, that Rebecca made that's worth, I think, reiterating because it's such a good one. You don't go to a grand jury simply to indict. I think that would be unethical. I also think it would be foolish. You ask a grand jury to indict when you believe you have evidence sufficient to convict at trial. They're very different standards of proof. Nothing is gained simply by indicting a case if you can't convict at trial. That requires more proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And good prosecutors will ask a grand jury to indict when they have that higher evidentiary standard met.
Right. So we don't know if that's the ultimate place this ends up or that request is made. But Chuck, that brings me to the point here that to me is the background context of this whole thing, right? Is you could pull out a law book about elementary criminal procedure, right? And that is important here. But the political, social, institutional realities of what we are about to possibly go over are enormous, historic. It hasn't happened before. I mean, Nixon was basically bailed out of facing this. It probably would have been in federal court by Ford's pardon. But, you know, if you're sitting in that office as a line prosecutor, or if you're Cy Vance, or if you're anyone who's been making that case, Rebecca, you know, you're about to, bring an indictment, like the biggest criminal case in the history of the country in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we should be careful because it may not be Trump himself who they are seeking an indictment for. We don't know whether it's the organization, somebody else in the organization, or Trump. So that's one thing, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's a reason why, as Chuck was saying, you would want even more so than usual to be absolutely 100% sure that you can prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt, because out there are going to be these allegations that, this is politically motivated. You reported at the beginning of your segment that Attorney General James has joined this investigation or is working with Cy Vance, and she campaigned on this notion that she was after Trump, which itself can undermine the legitimacy of this investigation. So you have to just make sure that you are able to prove this case in a way that's just bulletproof. And so, I don't know, and we don't know what happens at the end of this, and maybe it does end in a report. That's unusual, but it could happen. But I would think if we're at this phase that prosecutors think they can at least indict somebody. And that is, as you say, of historic importance. And so if they're doing this, that's why, again, I'm just inferring from their professional nature and the way they've approached these things in the past. I really doubt that they would do it, just on probable cause. I'm sure that if they are seeking an indictment of anybody in any case, but especially one that's so politically fraught and so politically important, they would not do so unless they were fairly convinced that they could prove their case, if not with ease, at least completely.
Well, and here's, the point I kind of want to get to here, right, is that, this could be the beginning of a very, very long journey. We don't know, and we don't know what direction it goes. But to the extent that you continue down this path, right, Chuck, the American criminal justice system operates every day. It's one of the most active in the world. We have more people incarcerated per capita than anywhere else in the world. And 90 to 97% of the cases that come through criminal courts are pled out. We plea and we plea and we plea and we plea. The whole machinery works that way. You can go to midnight arraignments at any city in America and watch this happen. That's the way what we're talking about here is just in a different universe. It's almost a difference in kind when you're talking about the scrutiny and the pressures and the standards and the resources that will be available to the people in the Trump org if that is where this goes.
Well, sure, Chris, but if Mr. Trump is indicted, he's not the first defendant with ample resources to hire lots of attorneys to defend him. So if your question is, can the criminal justice system handle a case like this? My answer is absolutely it can. It depends on a couple of things, though. You need a really good judge. You need a judge who can control her courtroom, who's decisive and smart, and who doesn't play to the cameras. You need good advocates on both sides. And to Rebecca's point, you need good evidence from the government, right, because it has to prove its case by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But if the question is, can the criminal justice system handle a high-profile defendant? Absolutely. That happens all the time. The fact that we haven't had a president tried before is probably due to the fact that we haven't elected a criminal to the presidency before. So I don't see this as an impossible task, not by a long shot. I see it as a difficult task. And a lot will turn on those factors that I mentioned earlier: a good judge, good advocates on both sides, and a fair jury. And when you're talking about a city with millions of people, you're able to put together a fair jury. It'll take time. You need to be careful. You need to do it right. But can it be done? Absolutely, it can be done.